This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 478, WEBAssembly. On today's show, we're talking about WEBAssembly, how it's used, and the cool things you can use it for with Drupal, with our guest, Matt Glaman. We'll also cover Darkmode JS as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Matt Glaman. Matt has been using Drupal since 2012. He currently maintains PHP Stand Drupal and is the primary contributor to the Drupal Rector, two tools which are used in Drupal's major version upgrade process. Matt, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me back. Good to be here.
And Matt, those two tools, they work for all major versions of Drupal, right? So upgrading to Drupal 11, I'll be able to use both of those?
Yes, and should add to the list the Composer Lenient plugin, which I recently found out officially replaces the Lenient Composer endpoint for allowing you to install modules that don't really work with the latest version of Drupal.
Fabulous. Although, so let me ask, I'm going to aside for a second here. Would you recommend using that on a production site?
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
we Drupalists love to run patches in production, so
all right,
why not?
Okay.
I mean,
Really?
software, like the way I think of it is just because someone else says it's a stable release, is it really stable? Is any code really stable? So like, why not? If you
so
trust
you're
it,
saying stable is what stable is to me as the person building the website. So everybody can have their
it's
different
what you
version
trust
of
in your
stable.
heart.
It,
It's how you trust in your heart, your processes and safeguards.
so
All right.
Well, wait. I have to say though, I just have to break in for 1 second. Yes, if somebody says something stable, it doesn't mean that it's not stable. However, I don't think that the inverse is also true, where if somebody says something is not stable, that means that it is stable.
So hey, if you
somebody
use it
says
and you tested it, it's stable for your needs, then
I guess I have managed to not use it yet on a production site. I will say that. It would be a pretty high bar for me to personally use it on a production site. Now, that being said, John, if it's like your personal blog, that's different than I think putting it on a client site. So like I might do it on a personal project, but yeah.
And listeners, that person with the incredibly high bar of stable is Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development. Nick, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Keeping us all on the level. That's good. And last but certainly not least, our guest host for the next 4 weeks, Suzanne Degrachava, co-founder and Drupal practice lead, at Evolving Web. Suzanne co-founded Evolving Web, a full-service digital agency where she works with large organizations on digital strategy and Drupal adoption. She created Evolving Web's professional Drupal training program in 2011 and has trained thousands of new Drupal users. And she is the marketing lead for Drupal CMS and the Promote Drupal initiative. Both of those are the open source marketing team that is rolling out the new Drupal brand, which is fabulous, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Very excited about all the work. And I didn't personally design the brand, but it's been a huge effort to get folks using it. And that's a lot of the hard work that we have left to do. So very exciting.
You didn't design it, but it makes it a lot easier to sell it when it looks really good, right?
Yeah. And somehow along the way, I've had to learn Figma and like flex my design skills. So it's
that's special. That's a very marketable skill, because even sometimes I look at Figma and I go, oh, that's like there's like witchcraft in there. So if you can understand it, you're doing pretty good. All right, let's move into our module of the week. And for that, we're going to bring in Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, John. Have you ever wanted your Drupal site to provide a widget that allows visitors to go over to the dark side of your theme? There's a module for that. It's called Darkmode JS, and it was created in May 2022 by Arthur Bagdasarian of Last Call Media. It has a 1.0.7 version available, which works with Drupal 9, 10, and 11. And it is actively maintained and has security coverage. There is one open issue, which is a bug against the current branch, but is postponed, waiting for more info, all of which is pretty good considering the site is officially in use by 89 sites. Now, the module is a wrapper for the Darkmode JS library, which gets 1,000 weekly downloads according to NPM. That library does have its own demo tutorial site, so if you want to understand the options it exposes, we will have a link for that in the show notes. The module provides options to control where on the page you want the widget to appear, what colors it should use, whether or not to store a user's choices in cookies, and whether or not to automatically match a visitor's OS theme settings of light or dark. Installing the module currently requires making some changes to your site's composer.json file, then configuring how you want the widget to appear, and finally placing the block in your site theme. The module also doesn't currently include a schema file for its configuration, which can cause some challenges, particularly for sites that run automated tests. But let's talk about Darkmode JS.
I am always on the fence with dark mode, right? I mean,
Oh,
it depends on the site. There's some sites where I use exclusively in dark mode. There's some sites that I refuse to use dark mode in. And then I do have an add-on that I use to just add dark mode sometimes when something doesn't have it. And I find that it sometimes breaks sites in unexpected ways. It sometimes doesn't detect that the text was lighter or darker, and then you just can't see anything. um, I have to say, in the past year or two, I've definitely I'm more on the side of I use dark mode more often, I think, and I don't know why. I don't know if it's like and it makes the experience better or I'm just more used to it. But this looks like a nice little widget to as long as you can configure whether or not it does that flash animation. I think it's a nice little widget.
my guess is because we're all getting older and dark mode is easier on the eyes. But hey, that's my 2 cents.
Could be.
I will
To
say,
be
Nick, there
fair,
is a time setting in there. So I think there is that you can control how long the transition is when somebody switches over. And in terms of
10
getting
minutes later.
10 minutes later, sure. It's like, am I having a seizure or is the site getting slowly darker? I personally got used to using dark mode on my mobile devices because, like with an OLED screen, it actually consumes less power if the
Oh.
screen is mostly dark. And so for some of my older phones, it would struggle to sort of make it through the day without recharging. Switching to dark mode was really helpful, and that's probably why I've tended to use it more. But
Martin likes to have the brightness all the way up on his phone, so that's another reason. Matt, what were you gonna say?
I'll say I don't use dark mode, and it's
Oh,
funny
really?
that only when writing PHP code do I use a dark theme. Like when I write in Rust or Go, it's a light theme in my editor.
Interesting.
And like, yeah, and even on my phone, I just opt for the grayscale the entire screen versus dark mode because usually dark mode themes aren't that legible to me. But if it's all grayscale, it works fine.
Interesting. Huh.
Why
Yeah.
why do you think that you do that with IDEs? Is it
That's
that's
just
interesting.
because know why? I think I know why. In middle school, I wrote C#. I did that in Visual Studio Net. That was a light theme. When I did PHP, when I started doing web development, it was Aptana Studio, and that was a dark theme by default.
It's so funny how
Using JavaScript and dark theme.
yeah, it's so funny how you can wire like that. Like it affect like I'm sure you could eventually overcome that, but it's funny how like it just feels more natural just because
Yeah.
you were first introduced like that. That's funny.
I really like, I don't know. I'm always like, it's just easier on my eyes. Like I'm staring at screens all day and like, I don't know, just looking at black is easier. I don't know. That's all I got. However, getting back to the module, for a brief second there, that this is front end only, Martin. Like, so like, your front end users can switch back and forth. Is it in the admin as well?
it's a great question. I would imagine if you were to place the block widget in your admin theme as well, it might work there as well. But then again, if you really wanted dark mode in your admin theme, you could just use Gin, which has that feature built in already.
Yeah, I could do that. I kind of moved away from Gin. I guess I could move back to it. I don't know. Anyway, okay. So front end dark mode, JS library. This sounds okay. I mean, do you happen to know if there are reasonable fallbacks if you don't have JS enabled? I know that's like a totally 1995 question to ask, but I'm just curious.
I would imagine if you have JS disabled, then nothing would happen. You would see the sort of default coloring of your site theme.
I was just looking for like everything to be black. Like people can't even reach your site.
It seems like the type of module that's relatively easy to turn on, but then in practice, you're designing a whole theme where you're making all these color choices while you already have to think about accessibility. And then you are adding a whole other level of things to test. So you turn that on and then, is the color contrast enough on button hover state, even in dark mode? So it seems like it could be significantly more QA on a project.
Yeah, that's definitely good. Yeah, definitely a good point. One thing that I think is also worth mentioning, and part of the value of going to that sort of like demo tutorial site for the library is that there are sort of like classes or CSS properties that you can add to like sections or elements on your site where it'll basically ignore those. So if you had like, let's say some kind of a map and you thought it was like having it try and reverse those colors was going to be a nightmare or something like that, you can just say like, ignore that map entirely. So that's potentially a workaround for some of those sort of thornier issues.
Just out of curiosity, how many of our folks on the call today actually use the Gin admin theme?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4. Everybody but me. Got it. Last but not least question, Martin, did you watch the Baltimore Ravens game last night?
I did. It was exciting. Right down to the wire.
Yeah, the beginning of it was a little concerning, but anyway. That's enough about sports ball. Martin, thank you for bringing us another wonderful module of the week. If folks wanted to connect or suggest a module of the week, how could they go about doing that?
We're always happy to talk about interesting modules in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.
Fabulous. Thanks a lot, Martin. Have a good one.
See you next week.
All right. Let's talk about WebAssembly. So Matt, let's start real high level, super high level here, because some of our listeners may not know what WebAssembly is. So, Matt, what is WebAssembly?
So WebAssembly is let's see, what's the best way? It's a binary so if you go to webassembly.org, their first little paragraph explains it pretty well, that it's a binary instruction format. So like how your computer runs on assembly code, which is like machine code, WebAssembly is machine code that runs in your browser. So how, like PHP compiles to C, which compiles to machine code. Think of it as another like virtual machine, like how even Java goes to JVM and Java bytecode. Everything in programming compiles down to something that can be interpreted on the machine. WebAssembly is just another runtime for that. And what's really interesting about it is it was designed to run in a web browser. It can run anywhere, really, but it was designed to run alongside a JavaScript engine inside browsers. So that way you could use JavaScript code to interact with like compiled code. And we know JavaScript is like a pseudo scripting language like PHP. So it just is a way to have some more advanced compiled code that can run in the browser.
So putting it in the terms of something maybe many of our listeners do understand, which is like PHP, right? PHP runs on a server. Like you write a PHP script, your website goes out to a server, the server runs through the PHP script and gives you back some data. Basically, with WebAssembly, you can do that process right there in your browser.
Yeah, so like instead of having the server or even like downloading an application and running it, here's actually a great example. I had a family member. They work for a company that used to like ship CDs. Like you bought the software and you got the CD and you put the CD in and you installed it. Like
Everybody
legacy.
remembers Columbia House.
So now they actually they compile it and ship it over the internet. So they have moved to a SaaS where you access the software in the browser because it's in WebAssembly. So it's a C application that's no longer distributed via CDs or however else. It's just in the browser.
Interesting. All right.
So I have one question. I keep conflating this with something, and I'm not sure if I should be or not. Is this something that progressive web apps use? Is it completely different, unrelated?
I mean, it could be. So like a progressive web app, you mean where something has like a manifest file and can be used
Yeah.
offline and has service workers?
Yeah.
So I'd say you're conflating them because the WebAssembly and Drupal work was leveraging a service worker to integrate,
Yeah.
but not necessarily. But if you were look at I guess let's take Notion. I have no idea if their desktop app is a progressive web app or not, but their web UI and a lot of these newer like I don't know, SASE type web-based platforms are using SQLite in the browser with WebAssembly. So you could be using when it downloads and becomes the progressive web app that's offline capable on your phone, maybe it's storing data in a SQLite database on your phone. And then when you come offline, it pushes it to the remote server. So it's not required, but it would definitely be like, I see it as a major like tool in a progressive web application.
Okay. And then, so it sounds like, just to expand on John's, clarification, like you can have, JavaScript started client side, and then throughout the years they built server side JavaScript, Node, all that kind of stuff. Is this kind of this is the reverse of that? Like all the server side stuff they used to have, now you have kind of a way to do it client side.
Yeah, or on the edge. I think a big way that's been talked about is like on the edge, like Cloudflare workers. So you wrote it in JavaScript that ran in a Node server somewhere. Well, they're like, hey, let's go rewrite it in Go or Rust because Go and Rust can natively compile to WebAssembly, and so can C via another way. But I don't know if you can't JavaScript directly, but the idea would be towards the edge.
You were just going to use an acronym for WebAssembly, which is
WASM. So
Okay.
it's WebAssembly camel case, and then the shorthand is WASM, WASM, which is a little bit easier.
Yeah, we can use them interchangeably, but I just wanted to put that out there so everybody kind of knew what we were talking about.
So since is it an it's an engine then, right?
Yeah, it is open source. It's
And
an
is it open
engine,
source?
it's a
Yeah.
runtime, and it's a standard. And every major browser has adopted it, and there's actually several different runtimes that are available, which you can also find on like the website where there's I wish I could remember some of the names off the top of my head, but there's every browser has a runtime in it, kind of like what browser you're on now. If you're using a Chromium based browser, you have the V8 JavaScript engine. If you're using Firefox, you have, I can't remember theirs, and WebKit has their own. So there's different JavaScript runtimes or engines,
Okay.
you want to call it. The same is true for WebAssembly. Which means that there's like there's some services around being able to run WebAssembly in their own runtime. So it's an open source specification. It's part of the W3C. It started out, it has a really interesting history, which you can go find pretty easily from your website. But it's not part of the W3C, but it has working groups and community working groups there. So it's a completely open standard.
Okay. Very cool.
And I guess I wonder, like, who's behind WebAssembly? Like, what are other folks using it for? Is there a community that developed it?
Yeah, so it has its history in a Mozilla project that I cannot recall the name of, but there was a Mozilla project, and then it kind of spun from there. I would say for anybody, just like go to Wikipedia for WebAssembly and has a really detailed history there. And I don't know the exact way that it transformed from there, but there is a specification. I'm not sure who's working on it, but I finally found some of the runtimes. So Chrome, Firefox, Safari all have their own runtime built in it, but then Node.js also supports WASM, and I believe that runs on V8, so same like Chrome, I assume. Deno, D-E-N-O, the new runtime that supports WebAssembly, and then there's like Wasmer and Wasm Time. There's a few other runtimes around it, so there's individual organizations that are building and working on it, but there's still like the core spec, and that is, I would imagine, just kind of like how Kubernetes is by different organizations. There must be like different, very large organizations contributing to it, because there are feature extensions being built. Like some extensions have been implemented across the board, some are still behind feature flags. Like for example, while working on the Drupal tidbit, WASM is still 32-bit integers, and there's the year 2032 problem that you need. So when after 2032 you run out of enough time and 32-bit integers, so you need 64-bit. Well, memory 64 is an extension that has a spec that is behind feature flags in Chrome and a few other runtimes, but isn't fully accepted and fully implemented. So there's the draft, and then it's up to every runtime to go implement, kind of just like all CSS works and ESM and JavaScript.
You're bringing me back to my front-end developer days where it's this nightmare of browsers and what they support. So I guess that has a big impact on what you can actually build or what features you can use.
Yes. Yep. So that is where you get some disparities. Like quick looking, yeah, memory 64, which is something I was really trying to experiment with, is behind feature flags in Firefox and Chrome, but Safari doesn't even have it behind a feature flag. So you can't even test it in Safari at that point. So there you do have that fun problem where there's all the working drafts, and some browsers have implemented things faster and then some others haven't.
So it sounds like a lot of browsers are supporting this and kind of including this spec in there in what they support. So like, as far as like a community around this, is there a community like the Drupal community behind WebAssembly, or is it kind of just browser manufacturers that are like, hey, we need to support this thing because people are using it?
It's a really good problem or question. Really good problem. Really good question. There's the Discord. I try to avoid joining Discords because it's just like yet another thing. But I assume that there is a community around it. And the question is just like, I don't know what that really looks like. I haven't dove into it because I'm not going to contribute to the spec.
Yeah.
And my implementation of it is far different than what somebody's like, hey, I have this random code that I'm going to compile and run out the CDN. We were trying to figure out how to run Drupal in a browser like a web server. And that's a very specific niche that involves like what the WordPress team has been doing, and Sean Morris, the maintainer of PHP Wasm, and then a few folks in the Drupal community. So I'm sure there are, and I just feel like I didn't join it because I would be very off the wall. Like, hey, I'm compiling PHP and trying to run PHP scripts. I need to figure out how to write my C code to integrate with Emscripten properly so that something happens.
You're not building like an app you need to work in a browser. You're actually building Drupal that you want to, try to build an experience in a browser. Got it.
I would say though, like, I don't know the community in necessarily around the project and implementation itself, but there's definitely a lot of people using it and talking about it because it is how organizations are scaling their web applications.
Yeah, I wonder if that's what a lot of the push behind it is. I mean, I feel like there's twofold to it. One is you can do more feature-rich stuff. You can do more like I think this allows a lot more application like experiences, but also I think you can push a lot of the the processing power elsewhere, which we need. Bigger companies need to distribute that in order to handle those.
So that leads me kind of to my next question of like, and the question is kind of, you've already talked about how it works, right? But I'm wondering, like, I don't know if we can get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts, because I imagine when you're like, one of the things about PHP, right, is that you're building a huge application and you're running it on a server that has like tons of resources and is capable of handling, pretty large, like, applications and tasks, right? When you bring that into a user's browser, I'm assuming that you're kind of like, I don't want to say handcuffed, but like you're restricted in the amount of resources and the kind of things that you can do. So like, how does it, how does it work? How does it overcome those things?
Yeah. So first, before we dive into how it works, it's part of it's reframing. When you think of a server, you're handling a lot of different requests and clients instead of just one. Think about when you're on your machine and you go in your terminal and you're like PHP-R and you execute a script, like an inline script. How fast is that? So think of it more in that context.
Mhm.
When it's in your browser, you're serving just you, not those. So you're distributing the load. And that's where it's like the edge comes in. It's talking about making like hyper local in there. And so, like, how does it work is your browser will download the WebAssembly, so like the WASM file. And then, as I brought up, it's intended to run alongside a JavaScript runtime. So there'll be JavaScript bindings, like a JavaScript API. So in the example of, I've only worked with it in Golang once. So like, let's go with C and Emscripten. Emscripten lets you compile C code to WASM. And that exposes the WebAssembly as a JavaScript module. So you can import it like you would any JavaScript module, or compile it, or do like a bundling. You like import foobar, and then you could say const my thing equals new foobar, and that will load and mount. Let's say mount the runtime, and now you can interact with it and call expose API calls. So that way, whenever you compile something into WebAssembly, you're telling that compiler what method should be exposed. So in the case of like the PHP one, there's run and like execute script. So run is take an existing file and run it. Execute is I'll give you a bunch of PHP code and you execute it. So for how the PHP WebAssembly works is you have your PHP object and you have the C call method. So it looks like CCALL. And that allows you to call methods that were exposed in the compiled runtime.
So I guess that brings up one of the questions I have then is how secure is it? How packaged is it? And I don't mean just from I say secure, but I don't mean just security, although I'm interested in that. But like, for example, how can you, if I'm using it to like process a bunch of data, I feel like you can use this to process a bunch of data locally and then send that up rather than sending the raw stuff up to the server and then relying on the server to run that. Can you trust the data coming from it, or is it something that a local user can manipulate?
I mean, it's in the browser, so a local user can manipulate it just as much as they could anything else. So I think the big part is considering what you want to do with the browser. So like manipulating data and sending it back up, like maybe, I guess, but it depends on the use case. So I'm trying to find the best way to frame this. So like, let's go to like the most common example is running SQLite in the browser. So browsers have, it's called indexed DB. So it does have like a pretty basic database storage, but it's slow. If you try the Drupal and WebAssembly trial, that's one reason it was slow, because all the files existed in this database and not on an actual file system. So one way to speed that up and optimize it is to run it in SQLite using the built-in in-memory and like an in-memory system in the browser. So in that case, you could trust it because you can trust it in so much as somebody could open their developer tools and find the object and execute it, which means that you trust it as much as you would any other JavaScript that's storing data in the browser. To which it's, always whenever you're taking in, so you would treat it on your server as you would any generic user input and not trust it just because you offloaded some of the processing to the browser. I think is the best way to put that. In the case of where I said there's the company that now ships their software over the browser. I don't know how they handle storage, honestly, in that. I just know that they transformed how they deliver the software. Maybe that makes API calls in the backend because you can do that still.
Yeah.
So there is no local storage. It's still sending it remotely in some way. It all kind of depends on what you're optimizing for. But I would say just because you're using WebAssembly to process something, don't trust the data any more than you would if it was pure JavaScript.
Yeah, and that's what I assumed, but it's good to clarify. We've talked about a couple of use cases. What kind of what are some other common use cases for it? Do you see, other than kind of the trial that you're working on, do you see any benefits for WebAssembly for Drupal users?
Yeah. So one way, so if I don't know if anybody's ever tried out like the Rust or Go or even Svelte, I think, and a lot of the languages have ways to try it in the browser, like in their docs. So that's one way. A lot of those are using WebAssembly to compile code in the browser and then execute it and test out running the code. And I saw a demo that the WordPress folks are trying that with their built-in. I'm actually not sure how they're doing it, because when I was working on it, I hit a few technical issues. Because with WebAssembly, you can download and add files into the file system, or actually add files to be loaded into it. So you could say, here's PHP, but then here's some default files to load, and then run code against that. But that would be the one main use case I could see is, I started to work on a PHP stand Drupal playground that was using Lambda and AWS coolness. But what if it was just WebAssembly? So that way you want to like run PHP stand against some code. Well, it was just using WebAssembly instead of pinging a Lambda function in the back end. Or if the Drupal docs could have a way to like try running some code to test out a hook in some way or form. It's a bit more complicated since Drupal's pretty stateful, but it would be neat to leverage WebAssembly in the Drupal sphere in that way.
So maybe it's a good opportunity to take a step back, because some people are paying close attention to all the work you've done, and for some people it's probably news. So I know when I got involved in helping out with the Drupal CMS project, I heard that there's this work that you're doing to create a in-browser trial experience, which to me seemed really like this opportunity to break down a big barrier for people trying Drupal. Like you click a link, try Drupal, and it starts actually loading a Drupal site right in the browser. So maybe you could describe a bit what you were working on with that.
Yeah. So the goal was to like you said, to make it much easier to try Drupal by just visiting a page, and it would bootstrap a PHP environment in the browser, backed with SQLite for storage, and it actually would download Drupal CMS and install the files into the browser and act as PHP, like Apache and PHP built into one. And by the time this episode comes out, I will post a blog post that rehashes my DrupalCon Barcelona talk that explains how this worked more in depth. So I think I'll add a lot more context to it. So essentially, how your browser would, normal browser would go to. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, sorry. We should probably preface this by mentioning that the direction has changed a bit, right? Just so that, because you're using past tense, right? And there's a reason for that. So let's maybe mention that quickly, and then dive in.
So the Drupal CMS trial has pivoted away from WebAssembly due to some limitations. One of those being Safari, or actually, no, it's not Safari's fault. Drupal loads too many files. We work with too many files, and actually the stack size inside the WebAssembly runtime in Safari, it's not high enough. Or maybe it's high enough if you have an M2 machine and a certain CPU. We didn't figure it out. Some people it works, some it didn't. It worked fine in Chromium and Firefox, but when you ran it in Safari, it basically said you're loading too many, the stack size is too big. So that was one problem, along with the speed, because again, so many files being stored in the indexed DB versus a true file system, which maybe that could change in the future. And also my own time allocation. Like I was able to work on it, but this kind of a feature needs somebody's half, maybe full time, or at least it needed half of my time, and I just couldn't allocate it. So for the sake of the project being able to deliver demos and meet its milestones, it's pivoting from a WebAssembly trial experience to some other provider but this definitely isn't the end of experimenting with it.
Yeah.
So that's why the past tense.
Yep. And so you were describing how it worked.
Yeah. So how tying back to the service worker tidbit. So in a normal experience, your browser hits the web server. That web server has Apache and let's say PHP FPM, the CGI pass through. And Apache serves a request, says, hey, PHP, can you render this for me? PHP renders it, passes it back to Apache, and Apache sends it to your browser. Well, with the WebAssembly work, we had PHP compiled into SQLite. So your browser is essentially Apache. And then there's a service worker that's acting like PHP FPM. So when you go visit a page, the browser says, hey, I'm going to request this. The service worker says, you know what? I'll actually handle this request. That's to the PHP application. The service workers can intercept HTTP requests. That's so you can have like offline mode and certain things. So then the service worker invokes PHP inside WASM and says, hey, go run index.php, server-side render the content, give it to me, and I'll tell the browser this is the content. And then the database is SQLite running in the browser alongside PHP. So you're able to then replicate the concept behind a web server and a CGI, in your CGI PHP FPM, all in one little web browser and not need a server.
I will say too that I didn't test it extensively myself. I tinkered with it and I helped with some build stuff, but the only piece that seemed slow to me, like when you first mentioned this idea, I was like, that's insane. There's no way in a million years you can even get it to work, never mind be performant. The truth is, I found it was only slow on install, right? It was slow to, especially if you were choosing like the events recipe, it would just take, I don't know, it would take 15, 20 minutes to install. Once it was installed though, maybe if you were loading something big or doing something, like it might be a little bit slower than a web server, but it was generally like it worked. Like it worked like a normal website. It stayed there. If you revisited it, it came back up. If you shut down your machine and came back, like it was there. And I think that piece is what impressed me the most about the capabilities of WebAssembly, right? It sounds like, from my perspective, outside looking in, the two hurdles were, um, you know, the Safari issue, right? That's kind of a hard limit that would need to be solved. And then the speed of the install. If there was a way to speed that up, I feel like it was workable. Um, I know you mentioned that there were some time limitations to solve those problems, but were there other kind of limitations that I'm not aware of that had
It
to be
was
solved?
basically that, and we had a workaround for the speed because if anybody's used Drupal's visual installer, even on a local machine, it takes forever. And Drupal CMS takes forever because it has a bunch of recipes and it's like 200 steps. So you have a batch process taking 200 steps, and if each batch process takes 10 seconds, you're still at 200 times 10, however many minutes. Like there is like a threshold. So one workaround is we are pre-installing and going to be
Oh,
importing the SQLite database. That was
yeah.
where we were ending up as the baseline. And then in the trial UI, you would apply which recipe. So it would have Drupal CMS, the baseline installed, and then apply the recipe on top of it.
Okay.
And that was the idea to speed it up and do that inside the WASM scripts, not in Drupal's UI, because once from the UI, how I said, like, let's say even on your local, even that batch process takes 5 seconds per step, it's probably too long. But in the browser, it took 3 times as long because it is slower.
Yeah.
So
Do you
the
think
idea was to delegate out of the UI.
Do you think if we were not trying to build a whole trial experience where you can actually have a functioning site that you can then go take and develop into a real Drupal site, and you were just instead trying to create a demo, that there would be more stuff you could front load and create an even lighter version?
I think so. I think so. And it was kind of there. I think we could have done that with how it was working. One of the problems is that there's like 5 problems to solve at once all the time. It was optimize the download, optimize the speed. Why isn't Safari working? Oh, we need to actually do some other feature as well. It's just it was really hard with the timeline to do a few things iteratively or take small wins. There was just that's why it needed to be like somebody's halftime, because there's really, to meet the milestones and the initiative
Yeah.
for Drupal CMS, just a lot of big things had to be solved without little chunks.
And it's one of those things where, you know, another team might finish a recipe or polish a recipe and add all these features, and all of a sudden it's slow again, right? So you also have to like follow ahead, and that always takes time and understanding.
Yeah. And it was a little complicated too, because we weren't just working with the WebAssembly. There was the PHP WASM has a JavaScript API on top of it. And like I was finding bugs in that and then contributing bugs to there. And maybe I had to do a custom build of PHP WASM to test something. And that took 25 minutes. And it just was, it's not an impossible thing. It's just literally time. And it's a very complicated issue with very few resources or others to chat about.
Yeah.
Do you think there are like other areas? Like I know you were primarily focused on the trial experience. Do you think there are other areas or maybe other modules that could use WebAssembly like effectively within Drupal?
I don't know. I'm trying to even think of like on my experience with projects where this would improve much of anything.
I guess I guess like what I'm trying to like figure out in my brain is like you have this thing that's built into browsers that you can use to basically run an application, right? So you don't need to like, I don't know, build a whole piece of software for your users. You can just build it to run in a browser, which is like people have been doing that for like years and years and years and years, right? I'm just wondering like, is there some sort of, I don't know, is there some sort of way we can use this great power within Drupal, or is it just kind of like, meh, not really?
I mean, it would be really interesting. I'm not plugged into the experience builder work, but I could see there being a way of, all right, we want to allow people to build custom experience builder components that needs to be compiled to Twig. And there's a JavaScript to Twig thing, or maybe we wrote one in Rust, right? Like everybody's using Rust to transpile JavaScript and TypeScript and whatnot. Why couldn't we write one that transpiled JavaScript to Twig? Something of that sort, or JSX to Twig. There we go. We will write a JSX to Twig compiler in Rust, compile it to WebAssembly, run it in the browser, so that way people can create components in the browser and save it to their Drupal site. Like right there. That's something that could be done.
Oh,
It doesn't seem too hard. I mean, okay, it's a hard problem, but like you're writing a Lexer.
But you're
there are
offloading
people
it
who-
from the server and doing it locally in their browser.
Yeah, and that's where I could see like WebAssembly being useful, because you, instead of doing that server side, you could put it into the browser and not have to do a HTTP requests. Because that's the other trade-off. Is doing it in WebAssembly going to improve the experience versus doing a few HTTP requests? Maybe it's not worth it, but if there's like 100 requests you need to make, maybe it is.
I also imagine like you kind of got the wheels turning now. I imagine in like an experience builder future, right? It might be a lot faster and a lot better for people to be able to do this stuff in their browser and like only save a page on that like final save, or at like that point where like, hey, this component's all built out and like ready to use and like ready to go. Now like make that request to the server. So it's kind of like a performance enhancer, right?
I also wonder if it could be used for things like expensive operations that maybe sometimes require, like, a lot of AI just integrates with ChatGPT directly, right? But there are, LLM models that are coming out that are smaller and decent that you can run. Like, is that something that you could run in WebAssembly and be like, hey, Drupal AI, like instead of sending it to ChatGPT, just sends it to a local LLM that's compiled into WebAssembly, and so you're not sending these giant requests and like burning resources on your machine. Is kind of just spread out. Or
here's where that would be difficult, because you still have to download the WebAssembly, and that was one problem with the trial. Is PHP compiled to WASM was still 14 megs, so it was a big that was a concern. You could optimize it. I don't think we had like encode. They didn't have it like gzipped or Brotli. But now you're talking about like an LLM, and that's huge, where browsers have one built in, so maybe that is it. Instead of writing JavaScript that interacts with the browser's LLM, maybe you can do it in WebAssembly, or the JavaScript is the bridge between the two. Possibly, maybe. So I guess that's why I do like the WebAssembly. It's like, all right, instead of just doing it all in JavaScript, what about this? You know, maybe it's expensive in JavaScript, but if you can write it in Rust and compile it to WASM, and I'm just saying Rust because it's a little bit easier. Golang, maybe that's the case. I feel like people will pick those up faster than C code, but maybe there's a way you can optimize a process from just being in JavaScript, put it in WASM, and you've made something a little bit faster.
Yeah. I mean,
I-
oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I wanted to come back to something you mentioned about WordPress doing this. I know when I first heard about what you were doing, I was looking at WordPress Playground, and that's sort of their solution for an in-browser experience. I'm wondering how much of that is open source, that you were able to look at it, or if you were able to leverage any of their code or see how it was applicable for Drupal.
Yeah, so I first looked at it a year and a half ago, and was investigating how they worked out. That's how I found the Sean Morris PHP WASM package that I was using, and then also had to compile my own PHP WASM because it wasn't working quite right. And the WordPress example, I tried to like dig into it, but they have they have a mono repo full of like mini packages, like micro packages all over. And it was a bit hard to discern what was going on, or to even run it locally. I think I could run it locally, but they have a whole different approach where they use iframes and temporary storage. So when you load the WordPress playground, how you can have like 10 sites, well, they're all in individual iframes, and they have a lot of logic around how you control the iframes. And so separating their JavaScript API from this was a bit hard, but it was really easy to like read, oh, here's how you compile PHP. And also I understood the idea that you needed a service worker to act as like the PHP FPM, and was able to look at their code and infer it. But their service worker has a lot of code that reads about like the iframe controller. I was like, okay, well, this is like far too complex for me to just be able to pluck out any reusable code. Yeah, it was. I mean, well, they also had a few engineers like building a very specific interface. That's the other part too. When I started building like the Drupal WASM one, I was like, let's make these components reusable, because it didn't start as part of the Drupal CMS initiative. Then it became part of it as a trial. My thought was open social. They have a Drupal distribution. What if they could now use this? Or like previously I was at Centauro, Drupal Commerce. What if the Commerce Kickstart demo could be in WebAssembly? There are a lot of people in Drupal and agencies who could benefit from this. So it was built to be a little bit more reusable out of the box, or a little bit more generic, that just says like, great, if you put a Drupal code base here, it will run. Not, we're going to let you run 10 different WordPress sites in your browser and a few other items there. I was able to look at their code to figure out how to do HTTP requests, because that was one thing. You couldn't do HTTP requests inside Drupal. So they wrote a C function that monkey patched it in, but then I raised it to Sean Morris, the maintainer of PHP WASM, and then he actually made that a feature. It's like now that's kind of built into it. So they solved some of those problems, but they have been working at it for a while, and they have not a few full-time, like partial time engineers.
It looks like there's someone from Automatic full-time on it, that there's like 1,000 pull requests. It seems like a huge amount of effort. It's not a one-person contribution team. So
yeah. Well, there's one or two, because there is a origin file system. So that way we could actually, instead of storing the files in the browser, like we could store them on your disk, on your computer's disk, and access them through WebAssembly. But with Inscripten, the thing that compiles C to PHP, the support's like kind of there, but not documented. And that's where I found like one or two of the WordPress contributors, because they're working to leverage that, so that way you can have a faster, and also be able to like download the code base because it's on your file system more easily. It's like right now,
which you can't currently do with Playground, correct?
Correct. like right now, I know for the Drupal when we built, it would download it as a zip archive. So we had a PHP script that could unzip things or zip them, and we would have to zip the entire code base and then download it for you.
So do you think then that there's value still in so it sounds like you think there's still value in pursuing this uh approach, mainly for, maybe eventually it gets back to the trial, but for now you would use it, just as demos for what previously were distributions. So
Yeah.
if somebody's interested in looking into that, where would they start? Do they start with your GitHub project or somewhere
So
else?
I would say not my GitHub project yet, because on my GitHub I have a Wasm Drupal repository. So mglaman/wasm-drupal, but it's a little bit outdated from the Drupal CMS work. I was trying to keep them in sync, so that way every time that I made changes in Drupal CMS, I backported them. But my repo was meant to be pretty reusable and like a generic web component that ran the trial. Didn't need that in Drupal CMS.
Okay.
So the repo's a bit outdated and needs to be revamped a little bit, but they could look there. And with what that repo provides, all you have to do is put a Drupal archive in place. And Mortensen actually brought up a cool idea. What if there's a way to just upload a zip file and it would unpack it for you, so you could just upload a Drupal site? That's one thing I wanted to add. So that could be a way, like, I want to try this out and figure out and see what it looks like. And in my playground area, that way you could just take, like, I have a Drupal site, I'm gonna archive it, boom, and now I can run it in the browser and experiment with it.
Okay.
So that's one thing I'd like to add back. And I know I would like to, instead of trying to focus purely on running Drupal and some of the quirks there, is like a Rector or PHP stand Drupal playground. Like, oh, I want to test Rector rules. And now there's a WebAssembly playground to run it. And you just paste in a bit of Drupal code, run it, and see if the rules change your code. Might have been useful for the object-oriented hooks implementation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I learned when you're programmatically changing code, you kind of have to have a standard starting place, and that takes a fair amount of effort. So that would have been nice. Um so one of the questions that I have now, kind of turning, we talked briefly about this before, but now turning back more specifically to security, are there any security implications to using WebAssembly or advantages specifically?
I mean, I don't know if there's advantages, and I think it's the same risk as JavaScript. Like, it is pretty sandboxed. Like, I don't think it can reach into, like, it has JavaScript bindings, but I don't think it can just reach out and touch any of the storage that's there. Um,
Okay.
yeah, that would be like somebody would have to go. I don't know the entire of it, but I remember reading, and it's pretty much sandbox. It follows a lot of same approaches for like how JavaScript tries to sandbox like cross origin. That,
Okay.
it can't just access your file system and do things because the browser can't, and you have to explicitly grant a certain it's bound to all the security things that your browser provides. So I
So
don't think WebAssembly makes it any worse.
so I guess also more specifically, how does it, where does that request come from or go to? Like, is it same origin? Is it like, do CSP headers interact with it in
Um,
weird ways, or did you
so I
not even
know
test any of that?
I didn't even test any of that because built in WebAssembly can't make HTTP requests. That is a spec for integrating with JavaScript promises. Actually, no, that's not even promises. Um, oh, that is one thing. So I believe that's all built part of the compiler. It's like mscripten provides a way to do XML HTTP requests. It doesn't do fetch. But you have to, in your C code, say, actually go do this XML HTTP request, and that adheres to all the cross-origin normal browser requests. So like Wasm isn't making its own HTTP request, it's delegating to how the browser would do a request.
Oh, okay.
So an example, in the trial, whenever I try to hit the announcements feed or the updates feed, actually the announcements feed worked, I think, but like the updates and the Drupal.org infrastructure doesn't have cross-origin request headers. So it crashed, or it didn't crash, but it failed. The request always failed because Wasm made a request and it was caught by the browser's cross-origin features with network requests.
Interesting.
I guess we've talked about this trial experience as being something that you tried. I think in my view, it was still really helpful for getting people excited and showing people sort of this missing piece in Drupal adoption, because it's something that could so clearly fill a missing gap. So first, I guess I want to thank you, because I wouldn't have gotten involved with Drupal CMS if I hadn't seen I think Gabor just showed me what you were working on and maybe linked me to the WordPress playground. But I'm wondering, you mentioned maybe a blog post to give people some context. If people are interested in trying, and building something on top of what you started, or doing other innovation on Drupal, are there any resources you would recommend?
So Sean Morris has a demo and like a whole like a PHP Wasm demo. So we'll put it in the show notes, but maybe there, because it has like a PHP embedded demo that lets you like run random PHP code in your browser, and it shows an example of like CGI demos, which has Drupal 7 running, not Drupal 8, and other frameworks. Although one thing I got to say, when you go to the demos for the other frameworks, it's like, oh, I ran Laravel. Well, you can't log in with the default Laravel. Like it's neat, but it doesn't showcase anything. That was the cool part with Drupal. It's like you can actually log in and do stuff. So maybe there, so you can just read into it a bit. I think the biggest resource is me getting the blog post up and enhancing my repo and documenting it, so that way people can try it locally. It's a very, very hard issue. I know some people aren't necessarily fans of using generative AI for solving things, but I could tell you what, if it weren't for having my little chat GPT to ask questions about WebAssembly, this probably wouldn't have gotten very far, because there aren't a lot of resources. As I said, at that intersection, there's lots of resources on WebAssembly. There's lots of resources on scripting, but saying I'm running Drupal in the browser with like a service worker that acts as PHP FPM, the resources are low. So after taking a pause, I'm going to revamp that up so others can start working with it. I know of 2 others who are using this for pull request previews. So that way, every time they have a pull request, it's like Tugboat. Now, as an aside, I don't think this could ever replace Tugboat, because Tugboat provides a lot of functionality, but they're using it in a similar way for projects that can't necessarily use that. So there could, like, by documenting this more, maybe more contributors can implement it this way. Or one way that I found it useful is designers. Instead of spinning up and paying for an environment, maybe you can just set this up, and then designers can go have the infinite amount of workspaces to check things out and review code or give feedback without paying for those environments. And hopefully, as more people start to use it that way, they find the quirks and they can get that momentum to expand. And that's how I'm seeing this. I want to build those resources so people can take that example, and then we'll kind of let the serendipity of experimentation take over from there.
I think the use cases that you're mentioning are really powerful. One thing that I've heard a couple times during the show that I'm just curious about is you mentioned your C code a couple of times. How much, like, I consider that lower level programming, right? I mean, it's not like it's not true assembly, but like, how, when you're working on something like this or working on a feature like this, how much C are you actually writing, or some other non PHP, non JavaScript code?
Luckily, I'm not. That's all on Sean Morris, who wrote some of the C code, and it wasn't a
Okay.
lot. Now, when he implemented the code in his one package called VRZNO that said, hey, when you do file get contents and it maps PHP's internal streams to the fetch request, I look at him like, great. I have no idea how you would have done this. Perfect. I'm glad somebody knows the C code. So when it comes to building it as like an end user, you don't need to know it, but I've had to look at the C code a few times because we had some weird errors. And I was like, all right, time to put on my C code reading hat and figure out what went wrong. But I've never had to actually write C code for this, but I've had to debug it or try to infer where things are to help. Whenever I contribute to something, I don't like to just write a blog, an issue and say, here you go. I'd like to at least try to take that little effort and say, given the code, I think right here is where it needs to go. So
Yeah.
insofar as that's the most I've gotten, I've never had to write it, but I've tried to read it and just help understand it.
Okay. That makes sense. And the reason why I was asking was it's another layer to contributing or building this tool. Like, I mean, there's a ton of talented Drupal developers, but I don't know. I wonder how many Drupal developers there are that are also regularly writing C or reading C. So that might be a slight barrier. So if you're listening to this and you do understand C or use C regularly, this might be a good place to help contribute too.
I'm having flashbacks to college, like C++ programming, and I'm like, I don't know if I want to get back into that. Matt, before we close out the show, so we've been talking obviously about WebAssembly quite a bit. We kind of talked about where it was in the Drupal community, but I'm wondering, like, for the future use in the Drupal community, what do you think? Where do you think people should kind of focus their efforts if they want to, like, if we want to see WebAssembly kind of grow in the Drupal community? Where do you think it's going to have the most impact?
I think if we start at like the right now, I think one of the coolest impacts would be like the Drupal Rector playground, where we have Rector and you want to see what it's like to rewrite some code in there. And I know right now Rector does have like the Rector package has one, but I'm pretty sure it's built with AWS Lambda functions that execute PHP in like like at a server for a few seconds. I think it'd be really neat to bring that forward, and maybe we can sprinkle it into some of the docs and just start going there, and then we can run the Drupal site. Now, maybe that's harder than running the Drupal site. I don't know. I haven't gotten to that part yet, but maybe I could see it being a little bit easier because we're just running a script and not managing HTTP like cookies and the login. So I could see that, and like, let's see how much we can do that and how much we can optimize the download, and the runtime size.
Cool.
And then take it from there. Like I said, Open Social or like Centauro with Commerce Kickstart, maybe they can create demos that aren't on a server, and that can be part of agencies could create their own demos, especially with, I don't know where the gates are going to open with Experience Builder, especially if, as I see there being a business ecosystem around Experience Builder. Now, I know in the Drupal world, some people are like, do we want that? If we want open source to survive, there needs to be a business ecosystem around it. It's not a bad thing. It's not a dirty word. And maybe WebAssembly can enable some of that. Like, oh, you're selling a style guide for Experience Builder. What does that look like? Well, come to our WebAssembly trial and you can see it in action.
I mean, I was even excited talking about Experience Builder and some of the performance improvements and usability improvements you could see using WebAssembly. So, like, I think those ideas are very very positive, and I tend to agree with you that business around open source is not a bad thing, and it helps support that sustainability. Well, Matt, as always, it was awesome having you, and I think our listeners definitely gained a new, very positive perspective on WebAssembly. So, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And just know, if you start looking into it, and you're like, "What in the world?" It's a hard problem. I still look at it like, I don't know all of it entirely. But if you are interested in trying out a bit more, just ping me on Drupal Slack. I might take a little bit to get back to you, but I'll answer questions as I can.
Sounds good. Do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. Connect with our hosts and the listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com by choosing the Become a Patron button in the sidebar. Alrighty, so we've reached the end of our show here today. Matt, if folks wanted to get a hold of you to talk about WebAssembly or commerce or any of the many Drupal-y things that you've done over the years, how can they best do that?
Find me in Drupal Slack at M Glaman, or on the Fediverse and Blue Sky as M Glaman, or my website has all those links, mglaman.dev.
Awesome. Suzanne, what about you?
Well, I'm up at evolvingweb.com. You can read a lot of the blog posts I write there. And then on the Drupal Slack, my handle is Pixelite.
Awesome. Nick Laughlin.
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixman, Nicxvan.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find out more about me at picozzi.com or at John Picozzi on the socials and Drupal.org. And you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Talk to you guys later.
Thank you.